Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a video on configuring an IP address. In this video, we will learn what an IP address is and how it is divided into two components called the network ID and host ID. Then we'll see what a subnet mask is and the role that it plays. Once we see how the IP address and subnet mask work together, I'll then show you how to configure your computer with an IP address, view its IP configuration, and check for connectivity with other computers. So what is an IP address? An IP address is a 32-bit address, now that's something I'll explain further in another video, that is used to uniquely identify a computer on a network. In an earlier video, I used an example of mailing a letter to help explain what a protocol is. Well, I would like for you to keep that example in mind because an IP address for a computer is a lot like a street address. See, an IP address is divided into two parts. The first part is the network ID. This is used to identify what network the computer is on. And then the second part is the host ID, which is used to uniquely identify the computer within that network. Now, like I said before, this is similar to how a street address works. Your street address is also broken down into two parts. The name of the street, which identifies what street you live on, and then a building number, which identifies what building you live on that street. So, for example, if your address was 123 Main Street, well, then Main Street is kind of like your network ID. It says what network you're on or what street you're on. And then 123 would be like your host ID or a unique identifier to which building you live in on that street. Here I have an example of an IP address. And this is something typical you would see on a computer in a network, and we would read it as 192.168.10.1. Now here's what we know. We know that this IP address has been divided into a network ID and a host ID. And we know that the network ID is the leftmost portion of the IP address and the host ID is the rightmost portion of the IP address. What we don't know is how much of the IP address or how much of the left side of the IP address is the network ID and how much of the right side is the host ID. See, every IP address has what we could call it an invisible line. Okay, we don't see it, but there's a line here somewhere. And that line could be right down the middle. And what that line says is that this particular IP address has a network ID of 192.168, so that's what network it's on, and then a unique identifier on that network of 10.1. Could be. Or we could draw the line here, which means that we're going to have just 192 as our network ID, 168.10.1 as our host ID. Or of course that also leaves us with an example of putting it here, which is the default, by the way. We'll learn about that in another video. But here we have 192.168.10 as our network ID, and then just the simple 1 as our host ID. There's no way to know for sure until you add another component to the IP address, and that is something called the subnet mask. The purpose of the subnet mask is to determine where that line is. And a subnet mask will always begin with 255s on the left and will always end with zeros on the right. And the reason why is because the 255s represent the portion of the IP address which is the network ID, and the zeros represent the portion which is the host ID. So in this example, you'll see here that we have 255.255.255. So those three, I've put them in green, represent that the IP address's network ID is 192.168.10, and then we have .0 in the subnet mask, which I've put in blue, to represent that the host ID is just 1. Now we just as easily could make the subnet mask 255.255.0.0, which would change this IP address completely. This IP address would now represent a network ID of 192.168, which is a different network than 192.168.10. And now that particular network has a host ID of 10.1. And then of course we could go a step further and make it 255.0.0.0, which would change this IP address all over again. Now the one thing to keep in mind is that for every IP address there will always be a complementing subnet mask. A subnet mask is not an optional component, it is a required component to go along with the IP address to define the network ID and host ID of a computer. So let's take a look at a quick little network that I've put together here. Here we have the internet, and I have separated us from the internet with a firewall. Here you will see we have a switch which is connecting my entire network here, my internal network, together. Okay, so we have the three components and they all need to be on the same network. So if we take a look at this client right up here, Vista 1, you'll see there's an IP address of 192.168.10.101. And it has a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0, defining that the network ID that we're on is 192.168.10. And my computer's unique identifier is 101. Now down here we have DG, which stands for default gateway. Don't worry about that. We'll talk about that in a later video. But just look at the top two components right now, because I want to look at these down here on DC1 on our server. Here we have an IP address of 192.168.10.201 with a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. This again defines that the network ID for this server is 192.168.10. So we are on the same network, and then we have to have a unique identifier, which the server has 201, which is unique from the 101 on my computer. So let's go ahead and take a look at my actual computer and see how we configure it with an IP address. And while we're there, we'll also take a look at how to view your IP configuration and check for connectivity. Here we are on the desktop of our Vista client computer. And the first thing I would like to show you is how to configure this computer with an IP address. Now in Microsoft World, there are always numerous ways to complete the same task. So I'm going to show you how I would do it. What I'm going to do is go ahead and click on the Start menu. In the Start menu, I'm going to put my cursor over the word Network. And then I'm going to click the right mouse button. When I click that button, a menu will pop up. On that menu, I'm going to select Properties and click my left mouse button. And that will bring up the Network and Sharing Center. Now this is something that is new to Vista. If you were working with an older client operating system like Windows XP, it would have taken you directly to the Network Connections window. In Vista, there is one more link you have to click to get there. It's right here where it says Manage Your Network Connections. So I'm going to click on that now, and you'll see it takes us into our Network Connections window. Once in the Network Connections window, we want to again click the right mouse button over our local area connection and select Properties. Once in the Property window, you will see here that we have TCP/IP version 6 and TCP/IP version 4. Don't worry about version 6 for right now. We will cover that in a later video. For right now, we're going to click on TCP/IP version 4 and again select Properties. And this is where you can configure the IP address for a computer. Now you have two options when configuring an IP address. You could choose the option that is selected right now, obtain an IP address automatically, which means this will all be blanked out. It's not only blank, but I can't click on it either. It's all been deselected. And that is because I'm not going to manually do anything. This computer is going to communicate with a server called a DHCP server, which is handing out the IP addresses. Or we could go ahead and configure our IP address manually, or sometimes it's referred to as statically, by clicking Use the following IP address. This will give me the opportunity to type in the IP address that I want to use for this computer. So I'm going to put in 192.168.10.101, just like we saw in the diagram, and then I'm going to hit Tab on the keyboard. And when I hit Tab, you'll notice the subnet mask is going to populate for me. 255.255.255.0. You may remember earlier I said that that would be the default subnet mask for this particular IP address, which we will cover in a later video. If you wanted to change that subnet mask, you could do so by just highlighting any one of the numbers and changing it. But I don't want to do that. I want to leave this at 255.255.255.0 so that we can communicate with the other computers on this network. If I go ahead and click OK and close, I've now configured this connection with that IP address. Now, you remember how I said in Vista there's that one extra step, right? If I close this window, we had that network and sharing center. Well, there's a lot of people who would really like to get right to the network connections window, just like we used to in the old operating systems. So I found a nifty little trick here you can do. Anywhere on your computer, and I'm going to pick the desktop, you can right click and select to do a new shortcut. In the new shortcut window, you can go ahead and type in the location of an item called ncpa.cpl, and then just click next, give it a name, and we're going to give it a name of network connections, right, because that's the window that we're trying to get to, and go ahead and click on finish. You'll see here on my desktop I now have a shortcut for network connections, and if I double click on it, it takes me right back to the network connections window. So that's kind of a quick little shortcut for you. Hope that helps you out. Let me go ahead and close out of this. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how to view your IP configuration. And the way we're going to do that is by clicking on Start and then selecting the command prompt. Now I have the command prompt right here on my Start menu. It's already available to me because I have selected it before. If you have not ever selected the command prompt before, then in your Start search window down here, just type in the letters CMD. CMD is the shortcut for command prompt, and hit enter. And that opens up a command prompt window, which is a text-based utility where we can use text tools to view things about our computer. So I'm going to go ahead and type in one of those commands now, and that command is ipconfig, ipconfig. And that command kind of makes sense if you think about it, because we want to view our IP configuration. Well, why not type in ipconfig? So I'm going to hit enter now, and you'll see that this shows me my IP configuration, which shows an IP address of 192.168.10.101, which is what I had entered in when we configured the computer, and a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. Now there is other information here which we're not going to worry about for right now. It is related to IPv6. Now another thing we need to do is we need to test connectivity. We need to see, can this computer communicate with other computers on the network? And the utility we would use for that is a utility called ping, P-I-N-G. Ping stands for Packet Internet Groper. And this is a utility that does just that. It's kind of going out there and seeing if it can grope or touch another computer. So I'm going to type in the word ping and then hit spacebar, put a space in there, and type in the IP address of another computer on this network. Now you may remember from the diagram that 192.168.10.201 is the IP address of the server on our network. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. And you will see here that I am getting a number of replies from that IP address. If I was not able to communicate with that computer, I would have gotten an error message of some sort as opposed to a reply. Now let me see if I can explain a little bit more detail about what's happening when you ping a computer. When you ping an IP address the way we just did here, what it's doing is it is yelling out on the network. It's saying, hey, I'm looking for 192.168.10.201, and if you can hear me, please reply back. Okay, and that's called an echo request. And then when that other computer, when that server heard that echo request, it sends back these echo replies. Now you'll notice there are 4 of them, and the reason there are 4 of them is because things do happen on a network sometimes that can, for a very, very short, intermittent period of time. When I say short, we're talking what could be a matter of seconds, milliseconds, nanoseconds. Sometimes we just refer to them as hiccups on a network, where you lose communication just for a brief moment. And if we only put out the one echo request and said, hey, can you hear me? And something happened to that one request, and we got an error message back, or actually we would get something called a request timeout, meaning we not getting any response after a certain amount of time, so that computer must not be there. Well, only one attempt wouldn't make sense. So we're going to go ahead and make 4 attempts. That way, in case there's a small hiccup on one of those attempts, we have 3 more tries. So that is how you configure the computer with the IP address, view its IP configuration, and check for connectivity on the network. Well, that wraps things up for this video, and at this point you should now know how to explain what an IP address and subnet mask are, and explain how they work together to define what network a computer is on and what its unique host ID is on that network. You should now know how to configure a computer's IP address. You should know how to view the computer's IP configuration using the ipconfig utility. And you should now know how to check for connectivity with other computers using the ping command.